Hello and welcome to another frostbitten and psychology-spittin' episode of What Happened, the YouTube-style pop culture media show that's found itself smack dab in the middle of the spookiest time of the year. And when you say spooky or, mind-shatteringly frightening, you can't help but think of the Silent Hill franchise. But unfortunately, when you say the Silent Hill franchise, you can't help but think, what happened? As groundbreaking and as memorable as the first 3, and to a lesser extent 4 games in the franchise were, there's a disproportionate amount of later entries which didn't quite hit the mark. However, one of the more positively received but perhaps still obscure projects that took place within Silent Hill's streets has a story unlike any other, a story which I'll be uncovering today. So grab your flashlight/Wiimote and 2009 era smartphone as I answer the question, what happened to Silent Hill Shattered Memories?
I love my daddy!
To tell this tale correctly, we need to go back to the very beginning, or more accurately, the origins. While many might remember Silent Hill Homecoming being the first Western-developed title in the franchise, allow me to shatter those memories to remind you of 2007's Silent Hill Origins. This, at one time PSP exclusive, focused on Travis Grady, a trucker that just so happened to get stuck in the wackiest town in the continental United States, and also functioned as a prequel to the original game which started it all. While not doing anything drastically new with the franchise, remains a solid enough entry, only really hampered by the limits of the PSP. It was developed by UK-based Climax Studios, directed by Mark Simmons, and designed and written by Sam Barlow, who was kind enough to speak to me for today's episode. Sam explained how the partnership between Climax and Konami following the release of Origins had been quite positive, to the point that they were pitching multiple follow-up projects back and forth. The team's first inclination was to start development on another PSP exclusive, but Sam was intrigued by the gameplay possibilities offered by the Nintendo Wii, which at that point was starting to dominate sales charts the world over. This marked the earliest beginnings of the game that would go on to become Shattered Memories, but it would still take many forms before it even got there. I was really interested in Wii and some of these ideas about the psychological gameplay. I knew our producer at Konami had a personal project, the idea of making a spin-off called Brahms PD, and so I wrote a pitch that kind of used that name and was about a detective who was in therapy. But that didn't work. Apparently, the idea for Brahms PD was supposed to be more of a straight shooter type game, so we reworked those ideas into a more traditional Silent Hill shape, the troubled protagonist wandering into town, etc. That became Cold Heart. Ah yes, Silent Hill Cold Heart. This was the initial concept Climax began developing, which would then be presented to Konami, which is evidenced by the extensive pitch materials that had been created for it. These images were meant to summarize Cold Heart's main elements and gameplay flow, and share a lot in common with the mechanics that players would eventually find within Shattered Memories. There were, of course, some very big differences though. It was originally designed to revolve around a brand new story and protagonist, namely Jessica Chambers, an emotionally vulnerable college student that winds up in Silent Hill after getting lost in a frigid and bitter snowstorm. Not only the story, but the gameplay was described to be quite different from Shattered Memories as well, as it was going to feature melee combat, finishers, and a variety of weapons which would degrade after too much use. A realistic inventory system was also planned for Jessica, where she could only carry a very limited amount of survival items in her pockets and backpack. The harsh cold would have also been another danger for her to contend with, as players would have to monitor her body heat and use emergency pills to keep her insides from freezing over. Climax even had ambitions to integrate the Wii's mighty Connect 24 Wi-Fi service to cull real-world weather data, which would then affect the game's frigid conditions on the fly, but obviously this was more of a pipe dream than anything else. While all these ideas sounded intriguing and quite fresh, there was just one problem. Konami decision makers seemed to be spinning their wheels on whether or not to actually greenlight the thing, which, for a good long while, and I'm sorry for this, left Climax out in the cold. After a long bout of playing phone tag with Konami about whether or not they could move forward with Cold Heart, the team would discover a way to possibly grease the wheels to finally get things moving. Around this time frame, Konami had Silent Hill Homecoming in the works and was set to be released imminently, and there was already plenty of trepidation from fans and critics regarding it, most of which would be well-founded. So, with that context, and this is my own theory here, there might have been some concern from Konami that another brand new entry/protagonist so soon would have been a bit risky, especially since they're venturing into the unknown void known as the Evergreen Wii audience. It's at this point where it was eventually suggested that Climax should consider chipping away at Cold Heart until it's in a more familiar shape, as it might get the whole thing jump-started. We were getting to the point of needing to get it to a green light meeting with the higher-ups at Konami. That was when, this is how I remember it at least, our producer pointed out that a remake of Silent Hill had already been greenlit a while back, and so we pivoted to make this Wii game a remake of Silent Hill 1. Then we could kind of skip a step and start working on things sooner. I asked Sam for a bit of clarification on that last statement, and what he revealed was quite interesting. Yeah, there was a proposed direct remake of Silent Hill 1 that was greenlit, but never happened. Shattered Memories took up that slot. Of course, with all the pre-production work Sam and the rest of the team had designed, like the snowy frozen aesthetic, the emphasis on psychological profiling, the cell phone integration, etc., suddenly bolting a straightforward remake of Silent Hill 1 onto those new mechanics wouldn't really work. Therefore, they would have to get more creative with how the game would be presented to both fans and critics. The reimagining was something we pushed for. We genuinely didn't think there was much left in the tank in terms of remaking Silent Hill 1 at that point. The movie had done its version, Silent Hill 3 had revisited that storyline, and Silent Hill Origins was a very straight retread of the locations and a lot of the atmosphere and basic storytelling. It felt necessary to have a more interesting angle on things to avoid creating something underwhelming. This tactic actually worked. Once the story of Harry Mason trying to save his daughter Cheryl was brought in and Jessica Chambers was taken out, the project got the official green light and was renamed to Shattered Memories. Konami would frame and advertise the project as an alternative take or a reimagining of the story and setting most fans were familiar with, which would not only be appealing to them, but also be an appropriate jumping-off point for Wii owners who weren't accustomed to Silent Hill's unique brand of psychological terror. Unfortunately, the delays in the greenlighting process, the concept of reimagining Silent Hill 1 rather than just emulating it, and coming to grips with the Wii's admittedly underpowered nature meant several gameplay elements featured in the pitch documents for Cold Heart would need to be scaled back or cut altogether. The combat and inventory systems were removed, along with the body heat mechanic, and the Wii Connect 24 weather integration, but in their place, more emphasis was put on the psychological profiling system and the lifelike flashlight and snow effects. For those not familiar with the former though, allow me to quickly explain. Through a series of interviews in the office of one Dr. Kaufman in between chapters, and what the player focused on and interacted with in Silent Hill itself, story and visual elements in the game would change to reflect that, which in theory would lead to a game that was somewhat customized to each player. Sam explained to me that implementing this and other systems on what was essentially two GameCubes duct taped together wasn't exactly easy. We kept throwing technical challenges into the mix. The seamless streaming, no loading, a lot of the rendering stuff, the ice refractions, the shadow casting off of each snowflake. We really wanted to make this a technical showcase for the Wii, as well as a lot of the gameplay, the psychology system under the hood, etc. A lot of that stuff we were creating from scratch. We also had a few layers of gameplay we wanted to incorporate into the nightmare sequences that we ended up having to leave on the shelf because of the constraints we had on the Wii and the amount of work involved for a team of our size. The chase-like nightmare sequences were created in lieu of the standard melee combat that was proposed in Cold Heart, which would have been done via motion-controlled strikes, grapples, and finishers. Instead, the nightmare sequences revolved around hiding and circumventing enemies, and would receive a divisive reaction from fans and critics in the final game, because while it played into the whole reimagining aspect quite well, some found them repetitive and confusing to navigate, although they only represented a small percentage of the overall gameplay. Now, something that's been mostly unknown up until now and was confirmed by Sam himself was that Climax were not only putting together Shattered Memories, but initially had plans to make a side project at the same time. This was another PSP title that was going to follow Michelle Valdez, the new character that was introduced in Shattered Memories, and would actually contain a few overlapping scenes with its bigger console brother, but sadly, it didn't get past the concepting phase. We had a PSP game that was supposed to be developed in parallel. At some point, higher-ups questioned why spend the money to make two different games, so they got rid of the PSP idea and we had a PSP port running of Shattered Memories. PS2 came quite late. Apparently, the series was very popular in South and Central America, and at that time, PS2 was the dominant platform there, so a PS2 port was thrown into the mix very late in the process. It's just super interesting that we could have gotten another completely different companion game exclusively for Sony's handheld, but like so many things Silent Hill, it was snatched away at the very last second, which included another potential project that was, again, I'm really sorry here, frozen in its tracks before it could make any headway.
How come you suck?
I lack confidence.
When Shattered Memories was formally announced to the public, there was of course some confusion about what it exactly was, as the concept of a reimagining of a video game was unheard of at that time and still kinda is, funnily enough. A game so different from its source material that calling it a remake would be disingenuous and not really accurate, as most everything about its gameplay and storyline, outside the inclusion of some core characters, was completely different. Even if the concept was intriguing though, some of that potential was slightly hampered by this very specific marketing image. This shot of Harry absolutely terrified, like he was in the middle of playing a particularly goosebump-inducing session of Ju-On for the Wii, had that certain je ne sais quoi that made it ripe for mockery. I specifically remember several websites, Destructoid mostly, poking fun at this image on a very regular basis, until eventually I believe Konami even cycled it out of its marketing materials and replaced it with this much more subdued one. When the game creeped onto Wii's in December of 2009 for North America and early 2010 in the rest of the world, it came at a very busy time. This was the height of Nintendo domination, with the company selling nearly 4 million Wii consoles in just 1 month, compared to the PS3 and Xbox 360, which only moved 1.3 each. The top 20 best-selling games were also largely composed of casual, motion-controlled fare, like Wii Play, Wii Sports Resort, and Wii Fit all in the top 10, with New Super Mario Bros. Wii sitting at the very top. Unfortunately, Silent Hill was nowhere to be seen in the top 20, and honestly, I couldn't find any solid numbers for it at all. So I asked Sam if he could shed some light on its commercial success. No idea. I know that by the time the game was ready, third parties were cooling on Wii. They weren't seeing the success with third-party stuff that they'd hoped for looking at the console's numbers. So I think it was already being expected to underperform there, and I think the release was fairly muted in terms of how hard the game was being pushed to the larger Wii audience. Reviews, thankfully, were on the higher end, nearly breaking a healthy 80 average for the Wii version, with many outlets impressed by the graphics, the voice acting, the writing, and one of the very best twists ever seen in a horror game, or hell, any piece of horror fiction in general. So while we're unsure of how well it sold, Konami were at least happy enough with Climax's efforts to continue to work with them. as the relationship did not end there. In fact, it was going to continue. We did keep pitching things. If I remember correctly, we had a project that was taken to greenlight, and we were excited, but then heard back that things didn't work out because it was revealed that Kojima was working on his own Silent Hill game, so I think that was kind of the end of that. It is a cruel, somewhat ironic fate that a new Silent Hill project was cancelled for another new Silent Hill project that was then also cancelled. Fortunately, this didn't affect Climax all that much. They ported Lords of Shadow to the PC, which is a great version by the way, developed the 3 Assassin's Creed Chronicles games, and assisted Housemarque in the development of Returnal. Sam Barlow left the studio in 2014, but has had an incredible run of creating some truly innovative narrative-based games like Her Story, Telling Lies, and most recently Immortality, all of which were critically lauded. As for Silent Hill, well, as of this writing, we are 2 games deep into its second, I think third resurgence now, and it's not going so great. Hopefully, the Silent Hill 2 remake can right the ship, but it really remains to be seen.
We did it!
But if you'd like to see how it's going, head on over to my second channel, Flophouse Plays, to see Liam and myself brave its rusty, dusty horrors. Thanks again to Sam Barlow for taking the time to answer all of my questions. And if you out there would like to nominate another haunting tale development in the video game or movie industries, let me know in the comments below or enter the foggy and/or frozen streets of my social media. See you next time, and thanks for watching.